Since the dawn of video games, competition has been at its core, with any multiplayer game playing off the natural atmosphere created when going face-to-face against your friends, family, and eventually Pablo Gonzalez's 2008 on 2-4 at 3 AM. One of the first taunt buttons was added in 1992 to the game The Art of Fighting, giving players the ability to gesture towards their opponents, draining their spirit meter. Yet gamers have found unique ways to recreate real gestures even without these features.
Look down. What do you mean, man? Bro!
As times have changed, these actions, although not explicitly taunts, have even gone on to be punishable as inappropriate behavior in some spheres. Whether a taunt has been coded into the game, sold as a digital asset, or has been birthed by a creative genius, what makes us want to taunt? Good sportsmanship is an honourable thing, yet the casual and anonymous nature of video games outline little social code of conduct on being a gracious winner. Many choose the noble chivalrous route of being stoic, shaking hands and feeding on internal satisfaction, but for some, that's just too boring. Video games are not always that serious, and funny moments happen all the time. Taunting can often simply be acknowledging that and building off of it, seeing a bright funny side in someone else's misfortune. Sharing an appreciation for a more playful environment shifted games towards taunting as we know it today. Dances, emotes, provoking sprays and trash talking down the mic should almost never be taken too seriously. It's obvious why we taunt in the context of trying to rile up an opponent to get them to think less clearly due to negative emotions like frustration, and we know the positives of sportsmanship and a playful competitive environment, but what about when you see something objectively bad happen to someone and you genuinely find it funny? You sincerely feel a little bit of pleasure. If you're honest with yourself, do you ever feel joy derived from the misfortune of others? The chances are you don't, because if you do, you are by definition a psychopath. No, of course not, I'm just playing with you. This is a common occurrence with the name Schadenfreude. The experience of pleasure, joy, or self-satisfaction that comes from learning or of witnessing troubles, failures, or humiliations of other people, which is a perfectly typical human emotion and can be seen in children as young as 2 years old. That being said, its morality is debated. Some scholars have condemned Schadenfreude as a malicious emotion, whereas others perceived it as morally neutral or even virtuous. Still, others judge Schadenfreude based on the severity and misfortune and the role of the Schadenfroh, the individual who experiences the Schadenfreude, in causing the misfortune. Finding a cause as to why we react this way can help us to understand how morally accountable we can hold ourselves to these feelings. This phenomenon has been noted dating back to the 18th century. Check out this painting depicting a group of monks laughing while a lone monk struggles with an ass. The top things to take in from this artwork are the Schadenfreude in action, the Sigma male who doesn't care, the even bigger Sigma who's fallen asleep from boredom, and dog. A taunt called the Schadenfreude itself was added into the game Team Fortress 2 in 2011, pointing out this phenomenon. Sure enough, it's become a staple in the TF2 community as one of the most popular taunts to use after killing an opponent in a funny, irregular, or unfortunate way, like falling off the map or missing an easy shot. Wang is a word that you might find funny, but is also Shenchen Wang's last name, a psychological researcher who, alongside analyzing the long-term socio-psychological exploration into Schadenfreude, created a model for it, which has three main driving forces of aggression, rivalry, and justice. So perhaps taunting and laughing after a victory isn't always just purely as lighthearted as you initially thought. In social psychology, the three reasonings for Schadenfreude are deservingness, envy, and group identity. If a person has a perceived deserved downfall, such as a high-status individual falling from grace or being cut down to size, which I see as humbling those with inflated self-worth, this could fall under Wang's justice bronze of Schadenfreude. If an aristocrat who is greedy and overly privileged loses his income and has to engage with standard society and is sad about that, many could see that as balancing out society and therefore morally fine to find pleasurable if they witness it, as it's creating a socially fair scenario. A major limitation the researcher Feather discovered, however, was that although there was a perceived deservingness causing the pleasure, a person may feel Schadenfreude first and then later justify one's own feelings perceiving the misfortune as deserved, pointing towards a cognitive dissonance. Despite this theory is still noted by Wang as an effective reasoning as how Schadenfreude occurs against someone who may be associated as having a personal causation, as in, they had it coming and brought it upon themselves. But what if the poor citizens are just envious of the rich? Could the humor come from a pure cope? Research shows that participants express a stronger envy towards a high-status protagonist and feel more pleased following his or her misfortune than that of an average-status counterpart. This would fall under the rivalry bronze of Schadenfreude. The envious person could enjoy the misfortune of someone they envy, as it increases the positive outlook of themselves by social comparison. Or that an individual can be happy that a person they were envious of is now in a state they have less reason to be envious of. Either way, it's a method for an envious person to self-evaluate using social comparison. Wang later mentions the relevance of low self-esteem positively correlating with Schadenfreude, which I think is definitely relevant here. The final intergroup theory suggests that in a competitive rivalry-based environment, such as a baseball game in one study, plays a large part in Schadenfreude. Self-reporting and monitored neural responses indicated witnessing your own team taking a loss produced a painful feeling and activation of the brain regions linked to physical and social pain, whereas witnessing a rival loss showed pleasure and activated the brain region involved in reward processing. The pleasure participants experienced also correlated positively with their levels of aggression towards the rival team. The researchers suggested that this was enhanced by the fact these intergroup interactions often provoked competition, enhancing the importance of their self-identity being tied to that group, contributing more to in-group loyalty and out-group aggression. My first thought, this would even apply to that aristocrat example, whereby the in-group could arguably be those who identified with social economic systems or from working middle-class backgrounds, seeing an aristocrat losing wealth as a win for their political ideology, if they assume that ideology as their social identity. External to these branches, hypocrisy is self-explanatory. People often find it humorous when someone else's hypocrisy is exposed at the expense of the perpetrator, highlighting cognitive dissonance, arrogance, or bad character. The morality of the degree to which this humor is expressed, however, is still very much up for debate. The deserved category of Schadenfreude is well researched and highlights the increased amount of pleasure derived when downfall occurs after a negative act. For example, in some research, a boy falling into a puddle after trying to damage another child's toys, or a puppet appearing to beat up another puppet who had done something wrong compared to a puppet who was innocent. Furthermore, those who exhibited high levels of Schadenfreude exhibited high levels of envy as a whole. Personally, I think this is due to the positive outlook by social comparison we covered earlier and could indicate that selfishness can contribute in some cases. This could tie into narcissism, which we'll get into later. Through understanding these subforms of Schadenfreude, one could hypothesize their developmental roots. The form of aggression derives from an earlier sense of social identity during infancy with a focus on themselves. Their envious form of rivalry derives from a concern for social comparison, focusing on one's own individual experience, which children must overcome to develop a genuine sense of fairness. And finally, the form of justice derives from this concern for fairness, which develops later in childhood, focusing more on others and punishment. This belief of justice can also be through faith, such as God punishing wrongdoers to create a just world. So now we know what causes Schadenfreude socially and how this develops in individuals, but what about the individuals who experience Schadenfreude regardless of these circumstances, who simply enjoy witnessing negative things happening to people? Participants in the study were read different stories of misfortune aimed to either induce effective empathy, Schadenfreude, or neutral emotions. Their facial expressions were then monitored, as well as giving a self-report of their empathy and Schadenfreude towards the protagonist. They were also asked to complete questionnaires to assess their dark triad personality traits, which are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. The results positively correlated dark triad scores with self-reported Schadenfreude. However, the results concerning smile analysis in the monitored facial expressions were mixed. Those with higher scores in narcissism found pleasure only in scenarios involving downward social comparison. Those with higher Machiavellianism scores only experienced Schadenfreude found in scenarios of intergroup competitions, whereas participants with higher psychopathy scores found pleasure in all contexts of bad events, which coincidentally lines up with fair treatment. Overall, these participants who scored highly in dark triad traits, especially in psychopathy, were also discovered to be prone to searching for videos of people getting hurt in daily life. Day-to-day sadism across the board is associated with dark triad traits, and Schadenfreude is recognized commonly among the average individuals. However, there may be an overlap. I know I joked about it earlier, but this was always a nagging thought in my head, and why I was drawn to try and understand why people find bad things funny. Wang's taxonomy of Schadenfreude somewhat supports this thought by suggesting the possibility that Schadenfreude induces a temporary state of that which is similar to someone who scores highly in traits of psychopathy, i.e. dehumanizing the victim in certain social situations or with specific dispositions. This is where it gets really interesting. When you yourself recognize that you're laughing at someone else's downfall, how do you react? I've sometimes caught myself finding something funny when I shouldn't and immediately feel remorse, shame, and try to screw my head on reactively. This being recognizing the mental state of the victim and noticing the slip in empathy and possible dehumanization. This is called an avoidance motive, which is a way to actively push away from experiencing Schadenfreude if you do not wish to experience it. However, the opposite approach motive exists where people feel rewarded for experiencing Schadenfreude, for example, celebrating success and justice. The baseline commonality in Schadenfreude is the dehumanization of the victim, temporary or otherwise, so I think it's important to recognize how we are doing this, why we're doing it, and where to monitor ourselves to prevent it from going too far. Aggression Schadenfreude is linked to a behavioral tendency to enhance in-group affiliation, which can involve ostracizing or being aggressive to those outside of the group. Justice Schadenfreude is linked to a behavioral tendency to punish others out of spitefulness, and rivalry Schadenfreude is linked to a behavioral tendency to exploit others wherever possible. understandable. I'd argue that if we're allowing ourselves to get this far, it's detracting from the humanity that we should strive towards. Wang touches on this lightly, mentioning that he thinks his taxonomy can supply a good foundation for the next steps for researchers, and advises them to look into the responsibility for individuals to partake in moral self-sanctions from experiencing Schadenfreude and other socially undesirable emotions, providing a valuable window into the diverse origins of the darker side of humanity. So, next time you laugh at someone else's downfall and taunt at them in Team Fortress 2, ask yourself the question, what made you taunt? And it's not likely that it's going to be the case, but is it humorous enough that they'll understand, or did your empathy drop too much? Thanks for watching, I hope you found this interesting. You can support videos like this by buying the Schadenfreude poster to work out why you just laughed at your friend's reactions to getting market gardened, or you can just subscribe, and I hope you have a great day.